Okay, well, I think we might get going. Welcome, everyone. My name's Ben Spies-Butcher. I'm a sociologist in the Macquarie School of Social Sciences here at the Wallumattagal campus of Macquarie University. It's a privilege to chair this forum tonight, speaking on Palestine or speaking out on Palestine. But first, as a matter of protocol and as a mark of respect, I want to acknowledge that we meet today from Aboriginal land. I join you from the land of the Wallumattagal on Darug country. I also acknowledge the lands from which our speakers and from which each of you join us. This land is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land. We especially welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander folks joining us for the discussion. Speaking from this country, it is important to acknowledge this has always been a place of learning, and it has long been a place of resistance. Many of our colleagues holding positions much like the one I hold in universities much like this have been killed in Gaza, and the universities and schools in which they teach have been destroyed. As teachers, we must recommit ourselves to learning, to seeking truth, and to speaking truth. We know there have been questions about the change in plans around hosting tonight. I feel privileged to be at Macquarie University academics speaking from the university and sharing tonight's talk. We had hoped for this to be a formal Macquarie event, but we're extremely thankful to APAN, who quickly stepped in to ensure that the event could proceed as it was planned. We're very hopeful that we are going to have more events from Macquarie in this space soon. Palestine has always been a challenging question. Public debate has always been difficult, but the current conflict has made those challenges far, far harder and much more urgent. Many teachers in primary and secondary schools are reporting that they have been forbidden from discussing Gaza in their classrooms. Multiple universities in Australia have adopted the controversial IRA definition of anti-Semitism, stifling the ability of academics to speak openly and critically about Israel's actions in Gaza. Doctors and nurses, healthcare professionals whose job is to heal, nurture, and save lives are being threatened if they demonstrate support for Palestinians in Gaza. The level of scrutiny feels unprecedented. It is why we come here tonight, to hear from those at the front line, to discuss how we can most effectively foster critical and respectful debate, and how we can make space for conversations that we need to have and voices that we need to hear. We are very lucky to be joined by 4 leaders, thinkers, and activists who have been navigating these challenges while continuing to speak out for Gaza. So tonight we'll be hearing from each of our speakers before opening up questions and to a broader discussion. I'll make sure we end on time by 7:30, but there should be lots of times for question and discussion. So we'll have a Q&A function open throughout the evening. We have a small team of organisers, which is wonderful, who are helping us manage the questions as they come through. So we'd encourage you to send questions like throughout the talks as you think of them, even if we hold off asking them for a little while. And so now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, my amazing colleague, Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah. Randa is a future fellow in sociology here at Macquarie. Her research covers areas of Islamophobia, race, the war on terror, youth identities, Palestine, and Arab and Muslim social movements. Of course, she's also an award-winning author. It is so wonderful to have you here. Randa.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you everyone on the panel today, everyone who helped us bring this event on. Thank you to APAN for hosting us, and thank you to all who made the time to join us today. I am speaking to you from Darug country, from sovereign Darug country, and I am here to bear witness to the fact that I am a settler on stolen land, and that this is something that infuses every aspect of my solidarity work, my own advocacy and activism for Palestine, centering First Nations solidarity and sovereignty. And as an academic, I think it's very important that we have the self-awareness to understand our positionality. So speaking to you as somebody who is an academic at Macquarie University, I am very conscious of the fact that I am at a university named after Lachlan Macquarie, Governor of New South Wales from 1810 to 1821, who was notoriously known for his brutal war against Indigenous people, notably the Apan massacre of 1816. And so it's really important that we don't, and certainly this is something that I try to be conscious of in my positionality at Macquarie, not to see this as something that's just a banal fact from the history books. And I want to reference here the amazing work of Professor Sarah Ahmed and her book on being included, racism and diversity in institutional life. She speaks about acts of naming, how building names can keep a certain history alive in the surroundings you are surrounded by, who was there before. A history of whiteness can be a history of befores. And I remember reading that line while I was at Macquarie University in my office, and I felt a haunting. I felt that this really was a call for us not just to bear witness to history, but to understand the land on which we do our work. And also to question, when it comes to writing and advocating on settler colonial violence, the fact that our teaching, our speaking, our research, our learning cannot ignore this history of befores. And what is happening in Palestine now tells us that before is now, that before is ongoing, it's continuing, like the genocide and dispossession that our First Nations brothers and sisters here continue to experience. Settler colonialism and genocide, it challenges our idea of time, our idea of a start date and an end date. And certainly what is happening in Palestine is a continuation of the Nakba, not something that started on the 7th of October. And in terms of my advocacy and my research and my scholarship at Macquarie University especially, I am very cognizant of those connections, the symbiosis between Israel and Australia, a white settler colonial nation state constituted through the dispossession, genocide, and domination of Indigenous peoples. And we have seen how that is not just some, academic statement or activist rallying cry. We have seen how it translates into the incontrovertible proof that Australia's government, whether Labor or Liberal, remains a staunch ally of Israel. A staunch ally to the extent that it will protect it and shield it and sponsor it and support and aid and abet in its genocide now, if ever there was any doubt about Australia's positionality. And when we look at, again, this idea of our work in the academy, I turn again to Sarah Ahmed and her work on the institutionalization of diversity, because universities welcome diversity. They welcome equality. They have committees about it. It is something that we put in our PDR statements, our professional development reports. It is something that universities pride themselves on in their mission statements, in the way that we write our grants for our academic work. But universities take the structural position of host. So as Sarah Ahmed says, diversity becomes a form of hospitality with conditions. Sarah Ahmed writes about this moment when she's talking about diversity at a conference and she's speaking, and then somebody in the audience challenges her and says, "But you're a professor." And she has this beautiful line which resonates so much with me. She says, "If only our arrival could be an undoing." And I particularly remember this line because when I got my future fellowship, which is precisely looking at researching, documenting and archiving a history of Arab, Muslim, radical decolonial activism in Australia, with a particular focus on Palestine, a future fellowship that I'm doing at Macquarie University, I would have naively thought that my arrival with this future fellowship could be an undoing. And yet here we are running this seminar on speaking on Palestine via APAN, not Macquarie University. Now, this wasn't a case of outright censorship or lack of support for the actual topic. It speaks to the way that the Zionist lobby has created conditions in which anything to do with Palestine is treated with hypersensitivity. And the bureaucracy comes crashing down and policies come in that really I would find hard to say any other topic in the university is treated in the same way. and we can explore that a bit later. But we know that Palestine is the ultimate exception to academic freedom. I have done a few seminars with staff at other universities, and there is a familiar theme. There are familiar and shared responses from academic staff. One of them is that the institution is part of the challenge. And again, it comes back to the fact that there is a chilling effect and a panic about Palestine in the academy. The double standards, whilst departments and schools readily and freely disseminated statements, for example, on Ukraine or on any other justice issues, there has been a deafening silence from schools that issue those statements about Palestine. And the absence of that speaks volumes. There have been concerns by academic staff about students and their safety and security in expressing solidarity with Palestine, about, in some cases, the draconian measures that they are exposed to and subjected to, security staff escorting them out of classrooms for wearing a flag of Palestine. Another issue is the challenge of being in a classroom as a teacher and having to obviously manage various opinions. Now, this only seems to be a challenge when it comes to Palestine, because we have a zero tolerance policy towards students who would, for example, espouse racist or homophobic or misogynistic views in a classroom setting. The problem is that Zionism is not treated as a racist political ideology. It is not afforded the normative interrogations that we subject all other racist political ideologies to. And because it is approached as something that has nuance and that has different spectrums, and it is treated in a way that shields it from its fundamental Jewish supremacist, white supremacist ideology, teachers are confronted with the challenge of not being able to say, this is not a safe space for Zionism, just as we say this is not a safe space for homophobia or misogyny or racism. And again, we are seeing the privileging of Zionist Jewish feelings at the expense of students who are literally connected to people who are subjected to a genocide as the classroom is unfolding. And yet it is not their feelings that are privileged or even taken into consideration. One of the things that we look at in the academic space, and this extreme panic and hypersensitivity to academics who teach Palestine, who speak about Palestine, who express support for Palestine, is that we know that there is a material cost to being accused of anti-Semitism. So it elicits panic because there is the threat of withdrawal of funding and by donors, by wealthy alumni. There is the threat of lawfare, the threat of media scrutiny, the threat of sackings. There is very little concern, by contrast, about being accused of Islamophobia or anti-Palestinian racism, because it is so baked into our institutions. It is so routine. It is so it's so part of what we expect as something that Palestinians and Muslims have to suffer through to placate Zionist feelings and to placate the Zionist lobby, that there isn't the same level of attention and scrutiny. And so we know that this is what we are up against, this hypersensitivity to the feelings of those who are defending a settler colonial genocidal regime versus the desensitization of the institution to actual Palestinian life being destroyed and actual genocide, being advised as academics to speak carefully, to manage our language and our tone. So we are always constantly typing our tweets, sending out our TikTok videos, wondering, is this word going to land me in trouble? Is this the tweet that is going to form the subject of a complaint, that is going to land me in disciplinary action? Is this the message that I'm putting on social media that is going to make the university cave into pressure? And it's, again, this inverse relationship whereby the victims of a genocide are the ones who end up having to police their language and advocacy in order to placate those who defend a genocide. Now, Australian universities are nowhere near where universities in Europe, the UK, and the US are yet. But if we want to know where we're heading, if we do not stand up to this, then we should look at what is happening. We have seen people like Claudine Gay at Harvard, the first Black president and only the second woman to be president of Harvard, forced to resign. We have seen students expelled, suspended. We have seen huge pressure on student bodies for Palestine, to the extent that Columbia suspended Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace. Mass censorship on university campuses. Closer to home, we have seen globally renowned professor of anthropology and social theory, Ghassan Haj, who is actually an alumni of Macquarie, recently sacked from Max Planck Institute in Germany. And so we are seeing where we are headed if we do not take seriously academic freedom when it comes to Palestine in the academy and these worrying trends. At Macquarie University and several other universities, there has been an adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. It's a working definition of anti-Semitism, and it defines as a certain perception, anti-Semitism as a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred of Jews through both words and actions. But it uses as an example of anti-Semitism, for example, the fact that the example claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, or denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. Now, the IRA definition has been described by experts as a settler colonial and racist text. It has been vehemently opposed. Recently, it's been opposed by mainstream Jewish American organizations. Many Jewish Australians have rejected the definition. Even the definition's lead drafter condemned the weaponization of the working definition to suppress political speech and critiquing the state of Israel. And that is a highly problematic development in universities. And at Macquarie University, where I am, it is, of course, always in the shadows, because it can be used as a blunt instrument to label anyone who critiques the state of Israel as an anti-Semite. And that creates an even further chilling effect. And there has been very credible, high-profile challenges to the definition, and also a research report in Europe looking at the way it has actually been weaponized against advocates of Palestinians in the academy. And they found, for example, the European Legal Support Centre found that 40 cases had been reported, and all of them, bar 2, had been based on frivolous accusations and had been dismissed in the end. But that's not the point. The outcome isn't the point. The point is subjecting academics to a culture of censorship, of unreasonable investigations and disciplinary proceedings, to the extent that it creates this chilling effect that we start to have a culture where academics are self-censoring. And we know that this happens in the academy. I want to finally end by asking, why is it important to speak about Palestine in the academy? And my good friend, the brilliant academic Lana Totur, who was asked this question at a seminar with me last week, and she asked the question in response, why not? You know, as academics, we are trained to historicize these, grand abstractions around free speech and decolonization and anti-racism and democracy. And that's what we are trained to do, particularly in the social sciences. And what we are seeing here is a moment of global awakening and reckoning of the genocidal violence of Israel's colonial settler project. Palestine has so much to teach us, as Lana said. It is a scholarly endeavor. It is a point of knowledge production, and it can be approached in so many ways in the classroom, from an anti-racism approach, from a settler colonial anti-colonial approach, from a legal approach. The ICJ is a defining moment in international law. Where are the voices of law schools around the country? Why have they not made this a point to rally around what is happening, to put on more seminars, to release statements. What does their silence tell us about the legitimacy of the law that they are teaching? What are they telling their students when they are ignoring this defining moment in international law? And if they are teaching it, but they are doing so quietly behind closed doors, again, how does that serve the cause? It is the cumulative, granular impact of this constant approach to Palestine as something that is hush-hush, that we have to do quietly, that we have to tone it down, that it causes the generative conditions that gets us here, gets us to a position that a genocide is happening and law schools are silent, that a genocide is happening and universities have not been at the forefront of knowledge production, of protesting, of leading the way, as we have seen with so many other justice movements and social movements before. For example, South Africa's anti-apartheid movement. So we know that we're not asking for something new. There are precedents for what universities are capable of doing and representing. So we know that Palestine is the exception. And that behoves us to work even harder to hold them to the standard that they have held themselves to for other causes. And that is why we need to keep fighting back and pushing back and really challenging the legitimacy of certain approaches that people take to the question of Palestine, so that it is not something that has to be approached with fear, with management of people's voices, but something that universities should take the lead on. And in doing so, in expressing a confidence to provide a safe space for us to be anti-Zionist, to be anti-racist, that sends a loud message to those who would seek to silence us, destroy our careers, intimidate and harass students and academics. I'll leave it there so we can open up for conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. And you could see from the engagement that's going on how powerful that your analysis always is, and cutting straight to the core of these issues and making it so clear the questions that are in front of us. So there's lots of engagement. Please keep that up. There's a little bit less in the Q&A. I think people are still digesting and thinking through any being engaged in the moment, but please put your questions and comments through in Q&A. We're going to come to those at the end. But next, I'm going to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Kate Ahmed. She's a neurologist and educator of junior doctors. She's an advocate for human rights and for environmental issues, and she co-runs the Australia-New Zealand Doctors for Palestine organisation. You may have also seen her amazing opinion piece in the Sydney Morning Herald on this very topic. Kate, it's great that you can join us. Over to you.
Thanks very much for having me tonight. I'm a bit in awe of the rest of the panel of speakers, and I do apologise if I'm not quite as eloquent. My day job's a doctor, so it's not my natural place to be, but I thought I'd just talk a little bit about myself. So despite accusations to the contrary, I'm not actually a single issue activist as such. I'm generally interested in inequality, and so I've got quite a long history in activism with environmental issues, so on things like climate change, on the protection of marine species in particular, as I'm a diver, so I'm particularly interested in this, on women's rights, and on the experience of junior doctors in the workplace, particularly women. So I've done a lot of this kind of thing before, and that I've been able to speak out. I've been able to actually encourage other people to join me, and I've been able to write things like opinion pieces. And I say all this because when I've done previous activism, it's generally been seen as a positive thing. You know, my workplace, my networks, they've come and said, I really appreciate what you're doing. I'm glad that you're standing up for this. I'm glad that you're doing something about it. And I think that's what makes the current situation so very different. And it's not that there isn't that positive feedback. It's just that there's also a lot of negative feedback. There's also a lot of, I like what you're doing. It's a good thing, but I think you're a little bit crazy. Maybe tone it down, maybe make it a bit more two-sided. I've actually had people say that to me. And then there's always this constant environment of fear, which I'll go into a bit more detail about as I talk. So what I thought I'd do is explain to you what's happened to us as doctors, but this also represents, I guess, the experience of other types of healthcare workers, including nurses and midwives. So what happened after October 7th were that their initial sort of rumblings were fairly immediate. So as healthcare workers and doctors, we have a lot of Facebook groups to discuss issues. And so some of those are mums Facebook groups, Dr. Mums, and some of them are Doctors for the Environment. And there's a whole heap of these things. But what we found very early on was that when people started to talk about Palestine and about their fears for what was happening there, was that they were fairly immediately shut down. And this happened in several different ways. So firstly, what we saw was that some of these groups just banned discussion of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Apparently it's too political, too divisive. And so you just weren't allowed to talk about it. Any posts that were put up were either not approved or they were deleted. And then in some other groups, what would happen is if you would post something, and the posts I'm referring to are fairly, I guess, innocuous posts. They're things like people fundraising for Médecins Sans Frontières and people just talking about the grief they're feeling at what they were seeing in Gaza. And what would happen was that if anyone posted anything, it would be jumped on by pro-Israel supporters. We didn't have a safe place where we could actually talk about how we were feeling and how we could help with the situation. So at that stage, we actually set up our own Facebook group, which is the ANZ Doctors for Palestine. And this group was meant to be there for peer support, advocacy, fundraising, and a place where we could talk, feel safe. There was nothing untoward happening within this group, but it was a necessary thing to start. It's now grown to over 900 doctors. But from very early on in the piece, it was used for, I guess, malicious intent. So whilst it's a private group and you had to actually gain access to the group by providing your medical registration number, you had to agree to the group rules, which included things like don't take any screenshots. This is a place for support and solidarity. People did gain access to that group. And sometimes initially they just claimed to be pro-Palestinian or pro-human rights. Sometimes they actually used Arabic names to get access to the group. Often they were just new Facebook accounts. And when you first set these things up, you don't really think that hard about the security because you don't, or at that point in time, we didn't predict that people would be coming there to try and hurt us. However, that is what happened. So many screenshots were taken from the group. And as probably people are always aware, if you take a statement and you put your own interpretation onto that statement, or if you take it out of the context in which it was given, it can be used to cause harm. And that's exactly what happened. The other thing that happened at the same time was a Melbourne man who is quite prominent in the Zionist community actually put a screenshot of our Facebook group on his page and encouraged people to make comments. And the comments that came were sometimes from our colleagues, and they were Islamophobic. They were pretty terrible. They referred to the cognitive abilities of Muslim doctors. But that obviously then made it the public a lot more aware that this group that we created really just for positive purposes existed. Unfortunately, from that, those screenshots were used to initiate a lot of complaints to our medical regulator. So our medical regulator is called APRA, Australian Health Practitioners Registration Authority. And as a doctor, probably one of the worst things that can happen to you in your career is to be reported to APRA. So prior to this, APRA was usually used for things like doctors who were impaired from, say, alcohol or drugs, doctors who were having sexual relationships with their patients, people who were just plainly incompetent or negligent. So to be referred to APRA and to know that there'd been a complaint against you, that's pretty scary stuff. And we know that because of that, the risk of suicide, the risk of depression and major depression goes up during the investigation period. However, many of us got reported to APRA. We don't know the exact numbers, but we believe it to be at somewhere around 50 to 60 complaints, though some doctors received multiple complaints against them. At this stage, none of those complaints have led to any disciplinary action. but many are still outstanding, and some have been going on for 2 to 3 months. And some of those complaints were that it makes it, I guess people might imagine that there were these really terrible, potentially anti-Semitic things happening, but the complaints basically were about anything that could be construed in a way that was seen as negative if you were pro-Israel. So one of them, for example, was centered around some advice that one of our doctors had received from their medical insurer. So we all have to have medical insurance, about how to post safely on this conflict without getting into trouble, essentially, or without having our careers threatened. So that was it. That was the post. But that was then reported as enabling people who were supporting terrorism. That complaint took months to resolve. So that doctor had to sit there for months and months and months, knowing that their career was potentially on the line. So that's one aspect of what's happened to us. The other thing that's happened to us is what we describe as doxing, though other organisations would disagree. And this first started in about December. And there was a few pages that popped up and then went away again. But then by the end of December, one had become quite enduring. And I first featured on it just before Christmas. And I did allude to this in the article that I wrote. Initially, what they did was they would take photos of one of us and they do what they call a profile. And the reason that this page exists is apparently to warn the public about us, because we're anti-Semitic doctors. We are apparently unsafe for the Jewish community to see, and we're unsafe to our Jewish colleagues. So on that page, they would usually find some screenshots either from our private group or from our Instagram or Facebook pages. Many of us do have public Instagram profiles because we are doing advocacy work, and it's very hard to do advocacy work with a private profile. And again, it was not, most of it is basically criticism of the Israeli government's actions in this current situation. And it didn't matter how benign the things were, they would be included. Like I was featured on one page because I asked for the UNRWA funding to be reinstated, and I did a petition about that. So, you know, feeding people, giving people the necessities of life, and that was seen as pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic. So there's about probably, to be honest, I don't go to the page anymore because I think it's disgusting and I think it's a waste of my time and energy, but there's probably at least 50 to 60 doctors that have now been featured on there. And some of the things on there are terrible. So doctors are being called things like supporter of gang rape of children, rape apologists, murder apologists, anti-Semitic, Nazis, foul language is used, calling people misogynistic things like a racist bitch or, and excuse my language, wet for Hamas. So this type of really disgusting, unprofessional, horrible language being used. And they also included our children. So the initial posts actually had pictures of our children fully there from our social media, faces uncovered. Later on, they realized that they would probably get taken down for that. So they would put an emoji over the child's face, but they took photos from my holidays. You know, I was away with my family. They used my family photos and they covered up my children with emojis as though that somehow makes it okay, and will continue to post. One of my colleagues, they actually featured her child, again, the face covered by emoji, but what they'd written underneath was, how would you feel if someone dragged your child, dragged him out of his bed and killed him in front of you? And if that's not a direct threat, I'm not quite sure what it's supposed to mean. But these are the kind of things, and this is the kind of environment that we've all been exposed to. So obviously, we reported all of this. We reported it to Instagram and the parent company Meta. And I would say it's probably been reported at least 1,000 times with all the people that have gone in and reported all the posts, and nothing has happened. I don't even think one of those posts has been taken down, let alone the account. We were all reported to the e-Safety Commissioner, and we were told that what was on there was not doxing because it was publicly available information. Firstly, it wasn't all publicly available. Some of it was from private Facebook groups, as mentioned. Secondly, I think it's very different to say that, to put up a post saying, for example, that I'm a racist Nazi and then tag my workplace, whilst also implying that I'm unfit to do my job and unsafe to manage patients. I think that's a very different situation to looking up your doctor on Google because you need to know what address they're at. So we did all that. They said nothing we can do. Police said nothing, file a report if you want to. We met with the Human Rights Race Commissioner, and we also met with the head of the Human Rights Commission. I mean, I'm not saying that they weren't understanding and helpful, but again, nothing was offered as a solution or a way that we could actually stop this from happening. We also reported it to AHPRA, the Medical Regulation Authority, because this group had been claiming to be working within AHPRA. We don't have any further evidence of that, but again, it's frightening. They were saying the reason they have all this information is because they get it from all the complaints that have been put in about us. So it's been absolutely terrible. And it was actually pretty disheartening to see that when the details of the Jewish WhatsApp group, the 600 members, were released publicly, that we had the Prime Minister speaking, we had the Attorney General speaking, we had new laws being introduced. And I don't agree with the release of people's personal information in any circumstance. But I also think that their experience has not even been anywhere near close to what we've been experiencing and what we continue to experience, because these pages are all still there and they're still publicly available. So I guess going on from that, consequences would be that we've got pretty terrible mental health in the pro-Palestine medical community at the moment. And that's because all of us are dealing with the images coming out of Palestine. We have Palestinians amongst us. We have many Muslims, Arabs, and people like me who are white and who actually see everyone as human around them. And so coping with that, but then also being told that you're a Nazi and a racist and you're a terrible person and that you should lose your medical license, it's been pretty bad. And just anecdotally, on speaking to our psychiatry colleagues, we've been told that there's a huge uptick in anxiety disorders. People who have had pre-existing issues have become sick again, and people have developed new anxiety disorders as a result of this. And I believe there's some further information coming out soon, which shows that this is, I think, relevant to the whole community, not just the medical community. Some people have actually had workplace problems. So there's some people have received warnings from their workplaces. Some people have been told not to post and not to continue with public advocacy work. And some people are just scared. So I'm in a position at work where I'm a senior consultant. So I have finished my training, whereas a lot of the other doctors affected are junior doctors. They have not finished their training. They rely on the goodwill of their colleagues to be actually able to continue to proceed in the career hierarchy, and on good relations with their colleagues to be able to secure work in the future. And I think also it's been particularly terrible for Muslim women. Muslim women who wear hijab are very vulnerable. They're already discriminated against in the workplace. And some of them have just chosen not to continue with their advocacy work because it's just too frightening and too personally threatening. Just to compound it, our medical institutions have been terrible. So we have not had good statements and support from any of our medical institutions, and they include things like the Australian Medical Association. And there are good people within this association. I know many of them, and I know that they care, but they've not been able to put out a strong public statement. And then we have our medical colleges, things like the College of GPs, the College of Surgeons, the College of Physicians. Again, despite a healthcare crisis, and I'll just highlight some of the facts here, we've got more than 400 dead healthcare workers. We've got 116 healthcare workers currently kidnapped. Nobody knows their whereabouts. Nobody knows if they're alive, dead, tortured. We've got 120 ambulances destroyed. Every single hospital in Gaza has been attacked, and 25 out of 36 are now non-operational. 95% of the world's 600,000 starving people are currently in Gaza. Thousands of children have lost limbs. The injuries are catastrophic, as you know. I mean, I think we all focus on the death count, which is, something around 30 to 35,000 probably at the moment. But there's also about 75,000 injured people. And these are not bruises and graves. These are like paraplegia, quadriplegia, amputations, severe infections, loss of eyes. They're terrible, and none of these people are getting the healthcare that they actually need. Despite this, however, our colleges, our medical institutions have made much stronger statements on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. They say they want to be neutral and they don't want to, alienate one side of this situation. However, they're quite happy to speak out on things like the yes vote, and rightfully so, on refugees, on Ukraine, with long statements, not only detailing solidarity, but also how we could help as a medical community. Keeping in mind that, we can do a lot here from Australia. We can do telehealth, we can do aid work. There's lots of stuff that we can do as a first world country, but no one's actually initiating any of this. And because of this, I think our group has come together to actually help and fill in this gap. And we've done a lot of things like petitions, which have been tabled in Parliament. We visited Parliament House multiple times to meet with politicians. We've written letters to the International Court of Justice, to our colleges. We've done our own fundraising for Medicines Sans Frontières. We publish articles, we organise vigils, rallies, we do peer support because a lot of our peers, like I mentioned, are not coping very well. But this should all have been done by our medical colleges, by our medical institutions, but it hasn't happened. So I guess just to finish up, I mean, our big thought here is that Palestinian advocacy, while it is absolutely about the people of Palestine, it's also about a lot more than that. It's about general human rights. It's about international humanitarian law. And is this something we apply to everyone, or is it something that we just apply to select groups of people who are on the right side of the political spectrum? It's about the right to protest. It's about the right to free speech. And it's about the concept for us of medical neutrality, which I think has been threatened by political bias. I don't think at this stage we are actually seeing that Palestinians are being humanised to the point where they deserve medical care that everyone else would expect. And really, as I think you all know, it threatens the entire world order of Western supremacy. And that's why I think it's been so very painful to see this pushback and this change, because, that's what happens when the power shifts. It's uncomfortable. So I have two quotes I'd like to finish with. One you will all be familiar with, from Nelson Mandela, and it's for all the reasons just mentioned. We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of Palestinians. And that is, again, because our whole world has to matter for everyone. It can't matter for a select group of people. The second quote is actually one that was said to a colleague of mine by another medical person when she'd run into a bit of trouble with this doxing harassment. And she was told, quite scornfully, "You post as though you have family in Palestine." And my question to anyone who would say something like that would be, why don't you? Why don't you as a fellow doctor? Why don't you as a fellow human? That is what we all should be doing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was remarkable traumatic experiences, but the work you're doing is just so incredible. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. And you can see from everyone's reactions that lots of people feel exactly the same way. We've got some great questions, but keep them coming. We've also got a couple more speakers before we open up to the broader discussion. So our third speaker is Sarah Schwartz. Sarah is a human rights lawyer and executive officer of the newly formed Jewish Council of Australia, an organisation I think a lot of people on this call have welcomed a lot. She's also a lecturer at Melbourne Law School. In 2019, she completed a Master of Laws at Harvard University, focusing on racism and mass incarceration. It's wonderful to have you with us, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. And I have to say, Kate, for someone who said that you weren't a natural speaker, that was such a powerful speech. You spoke so beautifully. Yeah.
Thanks,
so
Sarah.
I'm just going to talk a bit about the ways that the Israel lobby and many Jewish organizations try to silence Jews speaking out on Palestine, and then use that to also silence Palestinians and their allies. I'll speak a bit about where I'm coming from and also what led to the formation of the Jewish Council. I just want to first make clear what the Jewish Council of Australia is and is not. For those who don't know, we're not a representative Jewish body. We're not claiming to speak for all Jews. And in fact, we're very opposed to the idea of Jewish people being painted as a monolith or a single community. We are a group of Jewish academics, lawyers, writers, and teachers. We're independent and we're all volunteers. We've come together in this moment in the context of Israel's bombardment of Gaza to provide an independent Jewish voice to oppose all forms of racism and to support Palestinian freedom and justice. We formed the council because of what we see as the real abject failures of many Jewish organisations in Australia, who not only fail to recognise that Jews have diverse views on Israel and Palestine, but punish those who step out of line. And really, for all intents and purposes, have become Israel lobby groups, parroting the same dehumanising language which Israel uses to describe Palestinians and saying that any act of solidarity with Palestinians is anti-Semitic. I myself grew up in an environment where unquestioning support for Israel was assumed. While Jews could have a diversity of views on politics, when it came to the state of Israel, there was an assumption that we would fall in line. You know, there was a semblance of debate, but really it was only allowed to be within narrow confines. And as Randa said, you know, similar to academia, where questioning Israel's structure as a Jewish state was off the table. Over the years, really, as I became involved in social justice and human rights work, I couldn't continue to support a state which prioritizes Jewish rights over the rights of Palestinians and which enacts such extreme state violence and similar forms of violence to that which I see in my work at the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. Since October, like so many people, I've felt compelled to be more public in speaking out against Israel's actions which are done in the name of all Jewish people. When I did first speak at a public event in support of a ceasefire, I was absolutely floored by the backlash I received. People who I hadn't spoken to in over a decade got in touch with me, told me how upset they were. And, you know, the claims that they made were outrageous. They were claiming that I was fueling anti-Semitism and violence against Jews. People said I didn't care about the hostages or Israelis or my own community, you know, and of course I do. The question I have to ask, and I did ask, was why does caring about Palestinian lives mean that I don't also care about other lives? And although the pushback really shook me and was initially really demobilizing, in the end, it was galvanizing. It strengthened my relationships to other Jewish people who were also speaking out, and meant that I had the opportunity to meet so many Jewish people who told me that they also felt the same, but they were terrified of speaking out. And, you know, in conversation with other Jewish people and activists and Palestinians, you know, we spoke about why the Jewish voices that are represented in public debate simply don't reflect the Jewish voices that I interact with. You know, if you read the papers or turn on the TV, we hear this consistent narrative of Jewish people being scared of any chant at a Palestine solidarity rally, of people wearing the keffiyeh scarves worn in solidarity with Palestinians as they face overwhelming violence. You know, and we don't hear of the diversity of views within the Jewish community and Jewish people who are at the same Palestine solidarity rallies, making the same chants that with others and with Palestinians, and that those voices just aren't represented. And it was that disconnect which led to the formation of the council. In our first few weeks of starting the council, I think we're maybe at week 4, the pushback has been a lot the same as that which I received for my speech. We have countless people calling us capos, which is the name for a Jewish collaborator with the Nazis. We have people saying that we are actually worse than Nazi collaborators, that they could forgive Jews who collaborated with the Nazis, but not us, not Jews who call for peace and for ceasefire and who support Palestinian freedom and justice. They call us fueling anti-Semitism and traitors. Prominent tax lawyer and chairman of the Australian Israel Jewish Affairs Council keeps tweeting at us that we should be called the Jew-hating Council of Australia. And that isn't, you know, unique to us. It's the Jerusalem Post early on published an editorial saying that Jewish people who were rallying for a ceasefire, while still technically Jewish, are no longer part of us. And what they mean by that is that Jews who dare to support Palestinians should no longer be considered Jewish, as if they get to decide who's in and who's out, and as if being Jewish requires us to be Zionists. Jewish histories and cultures go back long before Zionism ever existed. Zionism was considered a fringe ideology for a long time, and one that was rejected by many Jews. And I'm not speaking about Jews because Jews are the victims here. We aren't. But dissenters are silenced so that the Jewish community can be painted as this monolith whose identities are all intertwined with Israel. It's so that the co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry can stand up at a pro-Israel rally in support of the IDF and say the Jewish people are together, one people with one mission and one destiny. And it is this portrayal of a singular community that then allows Israel supporters to claim that any threats to Israel are also threats to all Jews, and that any show of support for Palestinians is anti-Semitic. As Randa has said, this blurring of lines between Jewishness and the ideology of Zionism then means that Palestinians, as they face genocide, are expected to downplay their truths to avoid offending Zionist sensibilities, lest they be called anti-Semitic. And in this context where, the ICJ has found a plausible case of genocide, now Israel's supporters like Germany are being taken to the ICJ for their alleged military support of a genocide, and we question Australia's role and complicity in what is happening. The fact that Palestinians and their supporters are expected to defend themselves against accusations of racism and anti-Semitism is almost beyond belief. And the really devastating thing about this conflation of Jews and Israel is that it actually breeds racism. It means, that all Jews become aligned with Israel and its slaughter of Palestinians. We're all tainted with Israel's human rights abuses. But it also means that Palestinian people and their supporters are painted as enemies of the Jews and as anti-Semitic. It means that Jewish communal organizations become mouthpieces for racism, which we've seen in their language around Palestinian refugees fleeing persecution in Gaza and saying that these refugees hold values incompatible to living alongside Jews. And this has really come to a head in recent weeks when we've seen Jewish communal leaders refuse to talk with Muslim leaders or make common cause against racism in Australian society. The Council is trying to shift this by trying to disentangle real instances of anti-Semitism from legitimate criticism of Israel and thereby open space for that legitimate criticism. We want to speak out against all forms of racism and also to provide that Jewish voice for Palestinian justice, to combat the voices of our so-called representative organizations. We want to change that discourse and to support the change of the discourse and create space for genuine coalitions in support of freedom and justice. And the truth is that despite all of the limitations, the IRA definition, the accusations of anti-Semitism, more and more people do understand the logic of Israel and its lobby and are refusing to buy into that game. There have been genuine sites of power being shifted. People are refusing to be silenced. I'm just floored by such beautiful solidarity that we're seeing at the moment in organising for Palestine around the country. I'm thinking in particular of the Invasion Day rallies, where First Nations peoples invited Palestinian solidarity. People organising in their workplaces, in their unions, and my hope is that the Jewish Council can be just one part of trying to shift that power towards genuine organising against all forms of racism and oppression. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That is just amazing. And so articulately put too. It's extraordinary being on a panel with such remarkable people. Our next speaker is Luxa Turner. Lux is an Australian Palestinian interdisciplinary artist working across forms of performance, dance, drawing, and lens media. Lux has held several teaching positions in both public and private sectors for 20 years across creative and performing arts, as well as Lot and English. Thank you very much, Lux.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm joining in from Dara country of the Wongal people. And I myself have parents who hail from Jaffa and Haifa, Palestine, and acknowledge the genocide taking place right now in Gaza. We're holding a lot. There's a lot of ideas, a lot of feelings. So I'm going to try and keep this as streamlined as possible. I'd like to acknowledge my honour in being invited to gather with you all here today and salute you all for your solidarity over the last 5 months. I also acknowledge our collective sorrow over what's happening and our grief over the friendships and networks that we have lost, even though we've won so much more in each other. My honour extends further in today's sharing of dialogue alongside such esteemed people traversing academia, education, health, medicine and law. My strongest takeaways from my teaching degree were you don't teach your subject, you teach children. Great teachers are born and not made, and a good teacher has the capacity for reflection in action. I won't proceed to deconstruct these pearls, yet only surmise that they each advance the human element within us and anchors us in teaching from values-based positions. I regularly ask myself in my early years of teaching, to what kind of teacher would I feel good and safe with entrusting my kids' education? Would I be comfortable with a teacher who follows the department's milquetoast orders? Or would I want someone who fearlessly guides my kids into thinking laterally about our world and the nature of our existence? Writer and academic George Lakoff asserts, living a human life is a philosophical endeavour. Teaching from a place where the values of truth, humanity, agency, critical thinking, creative risk-taking are advanced is not the same place as following government email directives on how to be and how to speak. Turning up to work in recent times and being given 2 lessons to teach, one on totalitarian governments and one on media bias respectively, while being advised not to mention anything about the current state of atrocious affairs, is impossible to reconcile, let alone for a Palestinian. A loose equivalent of this would be expecting a Jewish teacher to give lessons on modern history without being able to mention the Holocaust. This is unimaginable for us, unless one is comfortable with coming across like a disassociated and completely checked out fool, knowing very well how many of our students have access to all sorts of things in the palms of their hands. And as I've recently confirmed, talking about Palestine with friends and parents daily. Some prefer and continue to talk about mere things such as the weather. Some of us don't have the privilege of such undisrupted lives and lineages. This kind of culture further permeates staff rooms whereby conversations shedding light on Palestine in my own personal experience, or even the broad dangers of dampening critical thought and challenging poor pedagogical practices within learning spaces are shut down with interjections from colleagues arguing they'd rather be talking about AI-made jokes, or my personal favourite, requesting recommendations for Middle Eastern restaurant at which to dine for the approaching weekend. Insert best wannabe bourgeois laugh. The ability to see one's own hypocrisies and sheer disconnect privileged by some is fierce. This, as a teacher, has also been really hard. It's always felt safer around children than adults. I can count on them for the precious truth. Only 2 weeks ago, a year 11 student asked me about my cultural heritage, and I was proudly wearing my kufaya, to which I pinched up a gather of this exquisite fabric and pointed, and in return, she silently mouthed. I told her you can say it aloud. Palestine, genocide, Gaza, massacre, etc. We can talk about these things. In exchange for her truth, can I, as a teacher, show her courage? They want us to remain neutral and impartial in the face of a horrific event committed in the opposition of neutrality and without impartiality. A genocide is not a neutral event. 2 Nakbas within a century are not neutral events. A brutal military occupation, a siege, a blockade on an Indigenous people are not neutral events. Yet the country in which we pay taxes is willfully complicit in this Zionist regime and wishes to silence teachers from talking about it with each other and within the classroom. Don't be so bold as to even think about contextualizing real-world current events within the microcosm of what we are learning today, nor suggest ethics as a parallel study to STEM, as I do wonder how our weapon designers and engineers think relationally beyond their inventions and their fiscal benefits, if at all. The Department of Education, who is insisting on teachers' silence under the guise of neutrality and impartiality, are in fact themselves biased, exclusionary, and far from neutral. We are allowed to talk about Afghanistan and Ukraine, as we've heard in other fields in today's chat. In fact, some students recall a swathe of assemblies with associated speakers and fundraising events in support of. The department had in their anti-racism policy subsection entitled Support in Times of Crisis, until their amendment in December 23, protocol for both Afghanistan and Ukraine within our schools, and only thereafter included a loose subheading for the Middle East. Still no mention of Palestine. And an even vaguer statement on how conflict in the said region is causing distress to some communities and schools. By the department's own anti-racism policy document, they are clearly exhibiting what they have defined as indirect or covert racism through their passive language. Institutional racism, the dossier is growing. Racial categorization by lumping Palestinians under the Middle Eastern umbrella. Quashing upstander responses in the silencing of teachers and challenging those who wear specific apparel and or place insignia on their personal effects in Palestinian solidarity. I won't scrutinize the rest of their policy document, but you get the picture of how vast their cognitive dissonance is. And this tacking to the will of our government's political position without question, dialogue and or reciprocal exchange between teachers, parents and students is turning some of our schools into places which feel and are culturally and psychologically unsafe. One of the most shocking examples has occurred in a Western Sydney school, where the students, many of whom are from cultural heritages who have suffered from the empire-led balkanization of Arab countries and have watched the Zionist Israeli entity further corrupt the region, has a principal who insists on raising the Israeli flag. I don't have to tell you how the presence of this flag may make many Arabs feel. I'm sure we can all imagine the collective outcry and media coverage that would be caused if an eastern or northern suburb school ever raised a Palestinian flag. Some of the questions which have been floating around in my mind the days I returned from a casual stint at school since October 23 reverberate along the following edges. Since when is entrusting the government with our psychological and cultural safety ever a good idea? Of what use is STEM without ethics? Is history without understanding human psychology? Since when did teachers and their history of strong unionism ever listen, let alone follow suit, a tepid email directive from the Department of Education? How am I, as a teacher, meant to be educating adolescents to deepen their critical thought, their confidence in tackling life's more complex issues, finding their voice, their creative risk-taking, their emotional resolve to withstand difficulty, their psychological resilience to traverse through dark waters, both personally and socially? How can we expect students to tell the truth, let alone speak truth to power, if we as educators do not model it? All this spectacle for neutrality and impartiality when our governments are clearly being anything but. Is giving a $917 million tender to Israeli weapons company Elbit Systems neutral? Is cutting off $20 million in funding to UNRWA based on alleged Israeli claims neutral? Why do we have to be neutral when our governments are not? Journalist Patrick O'Connor writes, the Labor governments, their departments of education, Zionist organizations and the corporate media have worked together to whip up a frenzied atmosphere of intimidation. The operative word here is atmosphere, not reality, not policy, not conditions of employment. We must get better at owning our stance as teachers and as those who actually are trained, qualified, experienced, and entrusted with the intellectual development and social welfare of our children. Standing up against a blatant genocide isn't wrong. We shouldn't even be arguing about it, and it's a playbook diversion tactic. I wish to resolve my talk with the words, sharing the sentiments of Mohammed al-Ghud. And it's a time for courage, humanity, and owning our flaws, especially our systemic ones, and having honest conversations about everything. Students are always aware of more than those in charge give them credit for. And no matter how slow the movement makes headway, nonetheless, it is doing so. And it is our responsibility as educators to ensure it continues gaining traction and fostering our collective grit for political solidarity. Resistance, which can take many forms, is the deepest form of love and resonates even more so in these last 5 months for myself. And we must commit to it lest we remain shackled in undignified bondage with our colonizers and our systems, which are very sick at present. Education, which has been plodding along in a post-war industrialist boom type of framework, holds immense possibility for revolution. Liberation starts in the mind, but is actioned in the guts and driven by our hearts because we finally truly believe we are all deserving of a life replete with kindness, dignity, freedom to play, the human will to question everything, and to author our own realities and futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Lux. That was incredible. Now, I'm first going to give an opportunity for the speakers just to make any comments or ask each other questions. But before I do that, I just want to read out a couple of the comments we've got through before we get to questions later. So Angela Clark says, this is not a question, but a comment. What a magnificent panel. Informative, generous, emboldening, encouraging. Thank you all so much. And another person who we don't have their name said, as Jewish woman here, no questions to the speakers, just wanted to say thank you to you all. I'm very pleased to hear the Jewish Council exists and that there is now a voice for Jewish people like me, wishing you all the best. So we're getting lots of great questions too, but before I start asking those, I just wanted to give any opportunity for the panelists to give a reflection on asking any questions.
I wanted to I want to leave it for questions, but I did want to pick up on something that you had said, Lux, about the vulnerability of students, and one of the reasons why I feel so passionate about what is happening in schools in particular is because we have had, since the war on terror, Palestinian has been a signifier for terrorist for Palestinian. And we can't ignore the fact that what is happening in schools now is not just silencing, it is also dangerous for students who are subject to suspicion as potentially radicalized. And I want to give you an example of this from a teacher that spoke to me about a school that had been approached in Western Sydney by police youth liaison officers in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with a request from teachers for information and referrals of students sharing material and expressing ideological views in order to monitor and assess them. It's just there was an explicit request. And this directive was shared among the teaching staff. In another case, there were reports on students chanting Free Palestine, and one student was wearing a bracelet that said Deen, which is the Arabic word for religion, focused, and that was actually linked to New South Wales School Communities Working Together, which is a policy that was introduced in 2016 under Premier Mike Baird as a range of countering violent extremism measures targeting schools. So what we're seeing is not just suppression and censorship. We're seeing students, their political agency, their solidarity with Palestinians being interpreted through the prism of a terrorist framework. And that is so dangerous, and yet another layer upon which students are going to self-censor, are going to police their political agency and language, not to avoid potentially getting in trouble under the law. And what that does at a time in your life when you are supposed to be experimenting with your political voice, where the time where you are being you should be in a space that really nurtures your political curiosity and nurtures the inherent and I would say very instinctive part of being young, which is to naturally feel strongly about justice and fairness. And instead of nurturing and encouraging that, it's being suppressed, and on top of that, being fed through the securitization framework, which can have really serious consequences. Like you said, in Western Sydney, most of the stories are coming out of Western Sydney schools with demographic populations that are a large proportion of Arab and Muslim students. So what does that tell us about the state of racism in the structures of our schools in New South Wales?
Thanks, Rhonda. Lux, did you want to respond to that? And then I might start asking some questions from the audience.
No, there's a lot, like I said, we're holding a lot, there's a lot to process. And I think for me, a lot of what I'm interested in is, yes, there are these terrorist frameworks. And I think of, and I might post it to the chat if I can find it, but there's a poem by Syrian poet Nizar Abani, which he says, when you call us a terrorist, okay, I am a terrorist. If a terrorist means fighting for my homeland, I'll be a terrorist. If it means protecting my family, I am a terrorist. It goes along those lines. And I think it's such an important time for us to help kids find their voice. I mean, this school is a time for intellectual, creative, free play and finding out who you are. Do you have the ability to critique things and develop that inner criticality, which is so needed at the moment? So it's how do we breathe life into that as educators? It raises some really interesting questions. So there's the frameworks, and then there's how we teach and how we possibly as educators might break a few rules in order to teach there. Thank you.
Yeah. So the first one I'll start off with. So this came during Rhonda's talk, but I think it actually is for everybody. When our elected officials at all levels won't engage meaningfully, what are the other avenues which we can push for change? No, Rhonda, I know Kate, you're about to kick us off.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll have a go. I think we all grapple with this every day, and I think one of the things that you have to remind yourself of in any type of activism or advocacy is that it moves incrementally, and it's often a combination of 1,000 or even 1,000,000 different small actions that makes the change. So I think when you hold a cause close to your heart, and especially at the moment when we're witnessing slaughter and human rights abuses every day, it's very easy to think, I just want to give up because nobody's listening, because the things that I'm doing aren't making an effect, but they are. So I think that every single email you write, every single letter that you write, every single tag you make on social media, the awareness post that you put out there. I mean, I wasn't aware, but people have come up to me and said, I had no idea this was happening in Gaza. All the things that I hear about Palestine are only from you. I don't see it on the news. I don't read it in the newspapers. So, and these are not people who are making comments or likes on my posts, but they're seeing it. There are people who see, even if they don't let you know that they see. I think I like petitions. I think petitions are very important. I think mass mail outs are fantastic, and APAN does this very well. I think making appointments to see your politicians, especially your local member, but also, you can write to Penny Wong, you can write to Anthony Albanese, and you can request a meeting. They are our representatives. They work for us. Don't feel that you're not important enough to go out and speak to them. You are. I think all of those things are very important. One of the things I also do and our group does is we try and remember Palestine in everything that we do. So we wear our kafires, we wear watermelons. If we go somewhere, we plant a Palestinian flag and we take a picture of that and we post it, because every minute of the day at this time in history, we need to be remembering Palestine. And all of those things, they make change. I know you may not see it. You won't see it. You won't see the Prime Minister come out all of a sudden and say, oh, actually, yes, I do condemn everything that Israel has done. I condemn all the human rights abuses. It's probably not going to happen. But you'll see this incremental change, and to some degree, we've already seen some of that starting to happen.
Thanks. Did anyone else want to chip in before I go on? Okay, I might, so some of the questions are a bit more specific too. So there's one, Sarah, a question from someone who's asking about their experience of Jewish friends they've had who have grown up with very strong Zionist upbringing and ideology. And as they find out more about what is going on, that process is actually very traumatic. To have a worldview kind of upended. And so they were asking, how can we support our Jewish friends navigate this highly problematic journey?
It's a good question. Yeah, the process of unlearning is hard, as it is with any ideology that we have to unlearn. It's a hard question because I think that in this moment we need to be speaking about Palestine, and so often, the media and other forums center Jewish people in this struggle. But I guess what I would say to the person asking the question is, it's really difficult to unlearn the things that you've been taught for so long and beliefs that you held. And, everyone goes through different journeys. And the amazing thing about coming to question, and coming to support another people is that you get to be part of a global movement, and a movement of, solidarity, and a multi-faith movement, multiracial movement that has so many amazing people in it. And so bringing your friend into that movement, I think is the best way for people to go through that process of unlearning. It's so important to just, for me, like having those relationships with Palestinians, with other people who are directly affected, and being able to see structures of oppression and injustice and apply that to other areas and to other politics, I think has been really amazing in this. And we're seeing people make those connections between Palestine and between settler colonialism here, between other forms of oppression elsewhere. And so it's I think just bringing them into the movement and taking them along to a rally. I think that I just keep thinking of the fact that so many Zionist organizations, the Israel Lobby, paints Palestine solidarity rallies as these hateful places, and where everyone's chanting from the river to the sea, and instead of that meaning what it actually means, which is a call for liberation for all people from the river to the sea, it's somehow like a genocidal call. And so bringing those people along and encouraging them to join the local Jewish collectives who are doing organizing on the ground and attending those rallies, I think is a great first step.
Thanks, that's fantastic. The next one is for Lux, from a secondary school history teacher who's been told that they can't discuss the current conflict in their class, and they're teaching in Western Sydney with a high proportion of Arabic students. Saying that feels shameful and like censorship, and asking for advice. What approach do you advise to what they might be able to do?
Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge I'm in probably a different place. I've taught for 20 years. I was a Federation rep in my early years, so I learnt to cut my teeth quite soon. I'm also in a position where I don't care if I lose my job, because do I really want to work in a system that it's purporting the opposite of truth, of values that I really resonate with? But I acknowledge that I'm in a place where I don't depend on that job. So I appreciate and understand how hard it may be for teachers in their first few years, for people who have responsibilities, fiscal, familial. It's a tough place. But I guess personally on a level, it comes down to, for me, I teach my values. What do I want these kids leaving with here today? And, there has been an amendment to the Education Act in the UK in 2016, which they brought in to help teachers and schools basically talk about all sides of the situation, or both sides. So it would stop this kind of thing where the department says you can't talk about anything. So you can talk about it, you just have to talk about several viewpoints and perspectives. So I think, there's almost like a leap of faith that needs to happen. But there's also subtle ways that you can do it by embedding it in differentiated learning. For example, I had to do a unit of work on the French Revolution, and then, through role play, through mock trialing, through playing out the 10-year reign of terror, like taking kids through that journey, it's kind of subconscious, and you can allude to it. I mean, I'm direct. I'm not known for my subtlety, but then again, like I said, I don't care if I lose my job. So I think you really have to find your voice as a teacher. You have to find ways to kind of break it down, to disseminate it through different types of texts and learning modules in the classroom, and also finding other teachers. It's even at the schools that I've been teaching at casually, it's been hard. And the first few weeks of October was extremely hard. I didn't know who to trust. But slowly you just start talking, and you find the colleagues with whom you share solidarity for this matter, and you support each other in that. And the more you become, the more it gives people permission and the feeling of safety to join this mission as well. So safety in numbers,
Can I quickly jump in to say that APAN is shortly about to launch the Anti-Palestinian Racism in Schools Register, where teachers and parents can confidentially report instances and experiences of censorship and anti-Palestinian racism in schools, and a report will then be compiled And that puts the Department of Education and principals on notice that these reports are being collated, that there will be a report and there will be a launch of that report, and so that they are on notice that they can't get away with this, that it is actually against anti-racism policies. It's against so many of the department's own policies, and it really it's important for these instances to be reported, and it can be done in a confidential way. So keep a lookout on APAN's socials. It will be launched in the next few days.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rhonda. There's quite a number of people who have been asking Kate how they can support the doctors who have had complaints against them, whether people have legal advice. Are there anything else that they can do? Can they contact hospital managements? What can people do to show solidarity in a practical way?
It is a hard one because hospitals are not centralized. There's so many different workplaces, and there's also like a lot of people who work out of GP practices. So it's not really like easy to communicate with all of those groups as a whole because they're all centralized. And our medical regulatory body, it's not, I don't think, I mean, you can send something in support there to say that you think that you support doctors being able to advocate for any social cause. I think that should be available for anything. But I think it might be worth potentially writing to our medical colleges, even though I guess average members of the public are not members of those colleges, but just to say, why aren't you saying something? Why aren't you speaking out and saying, this is the worst healthcare crisis that we've seen in our lifetimes, and possibly much longer than that, where the healthcare system's been deliberately targeted, where healthcare workers have been targeted. I would think that writing to places like the Australian Medical Association, the colleges of physicians, surgeons, general practices, there's about 16 of them all up, but maybe you could write an email and send it to all of them, just asking them why they're silent, why in this instance when we need them to be actually leading for us, that they're not actually saying something. Because to be honest, I think all of us would have felt a lot safer if our colleges had stood behind us, in the same way that if a union stands behind you and says, yes, we support you having a voice in this issue, that you feel that your workplace and your job is actually protected. So I do think it's hard because we're all in a different situation, but I very much appreciate the solidarity, and I know I speak on behalf of all my colleagues there too.
Thank you. The next question is for Rhonda. Should pro-Israel groups be registered as foreign influence organisations with the government under the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme?
I have no idea about that particular legislation, so I'm not sure. I mean, as a matter of principle, I think that there should be greater transparency about these groups and who they are speaking on behalf of, particularly when those groups then host IDF soldiers, as has recently happened, and give them a platform to speak, and the problems that causes in terms of the legalities of that, of having ex-IDF soldiers, in our community. There are legal repercussions for that. So I think there are a lot of questions that need to be asked and more pressure brought to bear. And I think there are lawyers who are doing that increasingly, but that particular piece of legislation I'm not familiar with.
So there was a similar question for a couple of the other people to the one I asked Kate. So maybe just a general one on ways that people can support the wonderful work that all of you are doing in different contexts. What forms of solidarity might be most effective to help people who are speaking out and who are taking what are unfortunately actually risks in doing so? What forms of solidarity have you all found effective? Ron, do you maybe want to try and kick that one off?
Okay, well, in the academy, for example, and then I'm going to speak about put my author hat on in terms of the writing community. So in the academy, it really is a question, and Kate, you alluded to it as well, about employment status. When you have academics and doctors and teachers who are in precarious employment situations, it is a lot harder and and very unfair to expect them to stand up and take those risks. They will anyway, because this is a cause that they're passionate about and it matters. But it really is very telling when those with the privilege and job security to say something and to actually make structural change don't do anything. They will often convey their support and solidarity behind closed doors. And we are at a time now where being quiet about your solidarity is not solidarity. It is not solidarity, and it is just performative, and it is just it is just trying to create some space for an acknowledgement of inaction. And personally, I'm not going to recognize or acknowledge that unless you take a risk, because this is the time now to take risks. In terms of the writing world, I've been quite disappointed again about the fact that so many authors have expressed solidarity, but quietly. They haven't taken the initiative to do what needs to be done. The fact, that children are being killed, the fact that libraries and bookstores and schools are being targeted and destroyed. This is, as everyone has said, an issue that affects every part of society. So it affects everyone, and it really speaks to who we are and what we stand for and represent and the kind of world we want to live in. And so I feel that very strongly, that more initiatives need to be taken from those with the position and power and influence and privilege to do so.
Anyone else? And no, there's a couple of minutes left, so this might also be an opportunity to make any final reflections from each of the speakers as well. Lux?
I just wanted to say, I've in the last few years, I've found a real need for this kind of cross-sectoral engagement. I think instead of being in our own silos, we really need to start webbing, interweaving to buoy each other. It goes back to, listening to Kate today was really harrowing for me. I could feel my anxiety go through the roof. And it's that insidiousness of the Zionist reach in systems. And I keep thinking about how people who love peace need to be just as organized as people who like power, for example. And how do we combat this? It's, we're actually in this kind of reactive place rather than, there needs to be some kind of, grassroots offensive almost. In my research, I came across a website called the Social Blueprint, it shows the reach in everywhere and how to go through into every industry so that these things happen. I've been given a job only to have it taken off me when they found out of my Palestinian heritage. So that's where the fearlessness comes in. And I think it is that bad. But then how can we start to galvanize? How is Palestine, as this point of knowledge production and learning, how can it actually show us how to be in society, how to create new worlds? I think it's a very powerful turning point. And I don't even resonate with the words free Palestine, because it is in fact Palestine who's freeing the rest of us. And I liked what Rhonda was saying about this undoing, and then somebody else mentioned this unlearning, this unbecoming. The word decolonial practice I've really fallen out of love with, because I'm like, how do you decolonize? It's then how do we create or activations for this undoing to happen? And how do we do it together? I think there needs to be a need for us not to be in silos anymore. We need to engage cross-sectorally, and I think solidarity will just keep getting stronger in those places if we can. We need to make time for it. I know we're all time poor.
Hopefully this is the beginning of that. Sarah, did you have any final comments?
Yeah, that was so beautiful, Lux. And I think, just on that train of like unbecoming, unlearning, it is, I think, just recognizing how painful it can be, and hearing your experience, Kate, how painful it can be to speak against the grain. For everyone here, there's been repercussions in doing that, and the need for us to really support each other through that, and to continue to push back against the way that this issue is framed as this fight between Jewish people and Palestinians, and to push back on that frame and to form genuine coalitions, anti-racist coalitions. I was listening to a podcast the other day which was speaking about a time when it was acknowledged it was acknowledged between Jews that fighting against anti-Semitism and racism was about fighting against racism experienced by other groups, was about turning up when Muslims, when Christians, when other groups were experiencing racism. And I think that, that is something that I think it's so important to go back to, because this fight against racist structures and oppression is a fight that for all of our freedoms. Yeah.
And Kate, did you want to add anything before we round off?
I'll just quickly say that if you're like me, if you have privilege, if you are white, especially if you're a white male, if you're senior at work, if you're financially stable, there is absolutely no excuse for your silence. And like Randa said, at this point, there's no solidarity in silence. If you're not out there speaking up and making change and actually pushing hard, then to be honest, unfortunately, you're complicit in what's happening. And what's happening now is a genocide, and there is nothing more important than that. So please use your voice if you can.
And Randa, do you have any final reflections?
I guess, well, the common theme that all of us have experienced is the chilling effect caused by fear. And I would say that the powers, the Western colonial order, the Zionist order, is using the most crudest, powerful repressive force because it knows it's losing. And that is our power. That is liberating. We know that they are doing everything they can because we have the moral platform and the moral legitimacy, and that should galvanize and give you the strength to keep going. There is no luxury for despair or for giving up.
Thank you all so much. This has just been an amazing session. We've got heaps of comments coming through just to say thank you to all of you, and how people have found hope and solidarity in a very, very difficult time through the session. In wrapping up, I also want to thank again, a really big thank you to APAN for hosting this event and for stepping in and hosting it. We really, really appreciate it. And also a shout out to Jemana and Amanda, who have been monitoring the Q&A and feeding stuff to me and helping organise this as well. But in closing, a big thank you to our 4 speakers. It's just been extraordinary. Thank you very, very much.